He is one of 3 4th century bishops that are known as the Cappadocian Fathers. And when I was in seminary a very long time ago, there was kind of a cult following for this group, enough of a demand that they offered a class on them. I liked them because it's basically the base of Orthodox theology as opposed to the direction that Roman Catholicism went. And it's got a lot of good things about it. They tend to be universalist. You're not going to get a lot about help from them. And they have the idea of life as being a progression toward God, theosis, and that's what the Christian journey is. And theosis sounds like you're going to become God. That's not what they meant. They meant to be talking about life as a way of a virtuous life, lived trying to be more like moving toward God is probably the best way I would say it. I picked Basil of Caesarea. The other two were Gregory of Nyssa and Gregory Nazianzus that you may have already heard of. I picked Basil because I had just come across a meme that was talking about, we'll come across it in the material here, about greed and sharing with other people. And I thought, these people still address issues we're dealing with today. Greed has not gone away. And so I'm going to, I've decided to focus this, because it's Thanksgiving, on the issue of being generous as a way of life, and living simply. If I had to summarize what Basil's message overall was, I would say it is to live simply so that you're able to share what's left over with other people, which is kind of a radical idea. And when I read what he was saying about basically if you have any money in the bank, it's because you haven't given enough money away. I thought, well, that sounds really good if you're going to be one of the recipients, but if somebody told me to empty out my bank account, that's a little harder to hear. So I have some questions on the back that we will get to about generosity. The first one being how much is enough and how much is too much. So as we approach the end of the year and Christmas and all of that, I think there's some, and stewardship, I will admit that that might be part of it. We'll talk a little about it. But I wanted to begin with Basil was a powerful preacher, and his sermons, I laughed and tried to imagine the reaction if I preached one of those sermons. I'd probably never be asked to preach again, because he could make you really uncomfortable with what he was saying. And it says a lot to his authority that people were willing to come hear him preach. He preached every single day. I'll tell you a little bit more about him after we hear this. Mostly I wanted you to see the icons. He is in the Greek and Russian Orthodox side of things where icons are a big deal. He's considered a doctor of the church both in Catholicism and Orthodoxy, and the Anglican Church recognizes him as well. One of the few people that's a doctor of the church in both sides of both Catholicism and Orthodoxy. So let me just play this. After all of that, we hope we can get it.
Basil was born into a wealthy Christian family in Caesarea in Cappadocia in 330 and educated in the schools of Caesarea, Constantinople, and Athens, where
We gave up.
friendship with Gregory, later known
That's
as
why
Saint
the
Gregory
captions are on.
Nazianzus. Shaken by the sudden death of his younger brother, he was converted by his pious sister Macrina. After visiting monastic centers, the young Basil formed a monastic community of his own in Ebora, near his home in Annecy, and lived there with his monks for about 5 years. He wrote many rules and guidelines for monastics so that all Eastern monasticism owes something to his spirit. Recognizing his gifts, the church ordained him priest in 365 and bishop of Caesarea in 370. As a bishop, Basil greatly cared for the poor and suffering and built an estate which included houses for travelers, a church, a hospital, a hospice, all with complete staff. A famine striking the area sent many poor and starving into his care. Their pain grieved him, and he labored to feed them with his own hands. He wrote, "If you are reduced to your last loaf of bread and a beggar appears at your door, then take that loaf and lift your hands to heaven and say, 'O Lord, I have but this one loaf. Hunger lies in wait for me, but I revere your commandments more than all other things.' If you should say this, then the bread you gave in your poverty will be changed for an abundant harvest." St. Basil greatly strove against the Arian heresy, in which he stood up against the Arian Emperor Valens. When called to account by the state for his orthodoxy, he conducted himself in such a way that the examining prefect, accustomed as he was to more pliable hierarchs, expressed astonishment at his boldness. Basil retorted, "Perhaps you have never had to deal with a proper bishop before." Basil wrote to his nephews to make full use of pagan literature, a rare attitude in those days, in order to gain a deep understanding of the Christian faith. Aware of his own shortcomings and dispirited by disappointments in his life of struggles, Basil wrote, "For my sins I seem to fail in everything." Nevertheless, he was far from a failure. His labors, including the writings of works on the Holy Spirit and against Eunomius, contributed greatly to the final triumph of Nicene orthodoxy at the Second Ecumenical Council of Constantinople in 381. The liturgy which bears his name is largely his own work. He died peacefully in the Lord in 379.
As loud as Brown sounds of that.
I think they were using one of those things that read things because some of the names were a little bit off. Okay, so he was born in 330 to a very wealthy family that was also very well known for its piety. He had a grandfather who was a Christian martyr and also a nobleman. His grandmother was a well-known saint on the other side of the family, and he was one of 9 children, and 4 of them became saints. So, and yet he was well into his 20s before he was baptized. Somebody had to convert him, essentially, which I thought was interesting because it tells you that they weren't baptizing babies at that time. Because in that family, for sure, if it was the custom to baptize babies, presumably he would have been baptized. You couldn't get a much more Christian family than that. But what he did instead of going into the church immediately was that his family sent him to Athens to study. And he studied there for several years. It gives you an idea how wealthy he was, because he was from Eastern Turkey. Is it Eastern Turkey? Yeah, Eastern Turkey. The area known as Cappadocia, which was kind of a backwater. But his family was Greek-speaking. They were essentially a Greek family, and he studied Greek philosophy, essentially, when he was in Athens. He met Gregory Nazianzus there, which was one of the other Cappadocians, and they became good friends. And he went to teach law and rhetoric. But something happened. He was converted. He was baptized. He took off and spent some time with the Desert Fathers as a hermit. And he decided that really wasn't for him. He must have been pretty brilliant, because he was a participant in one of the big councils of the church in Constantinople, where he argued against the Arians. He believed that the Arians said that the Son is created and really not part of divinity. He argued that for Trinity, that the Holy Spirit was part of God, and Christ was part of God, and God was part of God. I didn't want to talk too much about his Trinitarian work, which is what he's known for among scholars, because that makes most of us roll our eyes back in our heads. But it was important because what he was saying is that if you can be three individuals and yet one, if you're God, the same was true of humans, and that we are all individuals, but we all share human nature. And because we all share human nature, if another person is starving, we are starving. And if another person is thirsty, we are thirsty. So it was an important point. It wasn't just some theoretical thing. He was saying that you could have both an individual, but that person also shares a nature with others that makes them one. So I thought I wanted to talk about what he had to say about poverty and greed today, because it was a big problem then that a few people were very wealthy and a whole lot of people weren't. It was a time in which there were slaves, for example, and if somebody got into financial trouble, a parent, they might end up having to sell their children into slavery as the only recourse. The children were like property. And when he was made bishop, Basil became acutely aware of the suffering of the poor. He himself had already given away, he was a wealthy man who had already given away his money. He gave away his entire estate, which is kind of hard for us to imagine now. Could you imagine if, you're the child of say one of the Trump children, decided to give away everything they owned out of a religious conviction. And he also thought that not only the rich should be generous with what they had, but the poor should be generous as well, because being generous is the way you get closer to God, and you share whatever you had, as we heard him talk there. I wanted to start looking a little bit at excerpts from a couple of his sermons. So I thought the first one we'll start with is the one on the other side of the questions. And I'd like a volunteer to read this.
This is the time of famine and drought?
Yes.
Is the great, in time of famine and drought. Are you poor? You know someone who is even poorer. You have provisions for only 10 days, but someone else has only enough for 1 day. As a good and generous person, redistribute your surplus to the needy. Do not shrink from giving the little that you have. Do not prefer your own benefit to remedying the common distress. And if you have only one remaining loaf of bread and someone comes knocking at your door, bring forth the one loaf from your store, hold it heavenward and say this prayer, which is not only generous on your part, but also calls forth the Lord's pity. Lord, you see this one loaf, and you know the threat of starvation is imminent, but I place your commandment before my own well-being, and from the little I have, I give to this famished brother. Give then in return to me your servant, since I am also in danger of starvation. I know your goodness, and am emboldened by your power. You do not delay your grace indefinitely, but distribute your gifts when you will. And when you have thus spoken and acted, the bread you have given from your straitened circumstances will become seed for sowing that bears a rich harvest, promised food, an envoy of mercy.
That's a pretty tough standard. Reaction?
Well, I'd say it goes against a lot of what you would expect to happen in our society.
I'm sorry?
I said I would expect that this goes against a lot of what you would expect to happen in today's modern society.
Yeah.
I don't think a lot of people would do that.
I think it must have been challenging even then. The sermon was given during a big famine when a lot of people actually were starving to death. And to have that kind of trust that even if it looked to you like this was the last, it's all you have left, he's asking people to trust that God will provide for tomorrow if they give away to somebody in need today.
I hate to be cynical, but that's what a wealthy person would say. I mean, he grew up with bounty.
Yeah,
And a real poor person knows that those starving people grew up understanding that that's not always how it's going to work out.
yeah,
So he seems naive to me.
yeah.
Although...
Privilege.
Yes.
Yeah,
So I have some work to do.
yeah. Well, you should hear what he has to say to the rich. We'll get to that pretty soon. He sees generosity as spiritually nourishing. So to restrict generosity to the rich would be, in a way, by his way of thinking, taking something away from the poor. But anyway, yeah.
On the other hand, I've heard research that says poor African American women give away the most percentage-wise of what they have.
Yeah,
And so, in that way, this rings true that sometimes people with the littlest actually are the most generous.
yeah. I think that very much is a culture of people who don't have much money. I had a friend who worked in a government job for the Social Security Administration, including a lot of black women. And what she discovered there was that when generosity was a form of insurance. When somebody had financial need, they would literally pass the hat, and everybody would give as much as they could, and know to be able to trust that if they had an emergency, if their car broke down, they couldn't get to work, the hat would be passed for them. It's a lot more of a... I also read that one of the problems for people trying to get out of poverty is that if you live in a culture like that, it's impossible to accumulate wealth because somebody is always coming with a need and you are expected to give. So it might be good from a communal viewpoint, but for personal ambitions, it means that somebody is basically always dealing with requests for help. And if they get a better job or whatever, suddenly, and I know people personally this deals to, you know, they're the first one they call up on the phone when they've got a crisis. So you end up having to choose between relationships and getting ahead. More comments?
Well, does he always imply that you're giving away the last loaf, trusting that there will be a provision for tomorrow, or is he implying at least that it's more important to be generous than to live? That maybe you won't have food for tomorrow and you might die, but that's not the point. Does he say that outright?
I would say, I don't know if he addresses that particular, they talked a little about this. He was well known for, heaven knows he must have been good at collecting money because he had already given away all of his. But he built this huge complex right outside Caesarea that included a hospital. It was like first of its kind, where he looked at the needs of the people and built this place to try and meet them. It's almost like Mother Teresa or something. He built a hospital, a hospice, a hostel for travelers, a soup kitchen sort of place. They had all these different buildings. The monks that had gathered around him because he attracted people wanting to live a simple life in community. They staffed it completely. He must have been an extraordinary fundraiser. So on the one hand, he encouraged the poor to be very generous. On the other hand, he provided a place where people in need could go and get help. And he basically began the idea of, or one person I was looking at said that he was the one who started the idea of the church as an institutional social work sort of place, where they could address the needs, the physical needs. That charity before then had been more of an individuals were to be charitable, and he saw the need for large institutions because the need was so great at that time. But it's an interesting question. Oh. Why don't we take a look at these next parts where it starts from "I will tear down my barns" is from a sermon he wrote that was pretty pointedly aimed at the rich. There was what he did know as a wealthy person was that even though people were starving, that the wealthy still had lots of food stored away. And if he could get them to share it, there would be enough for everybody. So he preached a sermon on the parable of the wise fool. The wise fool? The farmer? No. The rich fool. Sorry. The rich fool. Does anybody remember that parable? It was the farmer who had such a bountiful harvest. His big problem was having enough barns to put it all in, and it never seemed to occur to him to give any of it away. Does somebody want to read the first section that begins the greed of the rich? Okay.
The greed of the rich is told in the parable of the rich fool. From God comes everything beneficial: fertile soil, temperate weather, plenty of seeds, cooperation of the animals, and whatever else is required for successful cultivation. But human beings respond with bitter disposition, misanthropy, and an unwillingness to share. Such characteristics are what this man offered back to his benefactor. He did not remember that he shared with others a common nature, nor did he think it necessary to distribute from his abundance to those in need. He did not keep even a word of the commandments. Do not neglect to do good to the needy. 3, and do not let mercy and loyalty forsake you. 4, and share your bread with the hungry. 5, he did not heed the urgings of all the prophets and teachers. Though his barns were filled to bursting with the abundance of his goods, his miserly heart was still not satisfied. By constantly adding more to what he already possessed, augmenting the existing surplus with annual increases, he fell into this intractable dilemma. He refused to be satisfied with what he already had on account of his own greed.
Somebody else? Do you want to read?
Consider yourself who you are, what resources have been entrusted to you, from whom you have received them, and why you received more than others. You have been made a minister of God's goodness, a steward of your fellow servants. Do not suppose that all this was furnished to you for your own gullet. Resolve to treat the things in your possession as belonging to others. After all, they bring pleasure for only a little while, then fade away and disappear. But afterwards, a strict accounting of their disbursement will be demanded from you.
Comments? So why is he saying you should be generous?
Well, part of it, he's saying that you're not going to give it away anyway at some point, right?
Yeah.
When you die, it's all going to be taken away from you, so give it away before it gets taken from you.
Yeah. You can't take it with you.
There's something in there about, well, that the purpose of having what you have is to share. So it sort of moves on to this theology, nothing we have is our own, it is God's.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of, we're stewards of it, and the purpose of it is to give it away, make sure there's enough for everyone.
Yeah.
Took the words out of my mouth.
Which is,
Yeah, and along that, I mean, that's something that I have been uniquely aware of, even with our obligation of tithing. It's not always that we're tithing here, but if we're taking something, because if where simply it flows through us. And if you stop that, then you're no longer being a conduit for God to work through you, and that's never been the intention, regardless of whether it's a giving of your goods, or giving of your spirit, or giving of your time. And not only that, but if Christ is in us and the Father is in us, then He's also in everybody else that you meet, right? And and then Christ also said, what you do unto the least of these, you do unto me. And if you're going to deny that to the least of these, then you're going to deny having given it to Christ, and I think He's going to know that.
Yeah.
We kind of forget that we are not different. That was Basil's point, is we are a unified people. We're all of the same spirit. And what you don't do for others, you don't do for God, but you also don't do for the Father. You have to remember to see Christ in everybody that you meet. And on the way here, I passed no less than 12 people, homeless people riding MARTA on at least 2 cars, and that was only 2 cars. So the need is very real.
Yeah.
Still.
Well, I also noticed what's missing from him is any talk of tithing. He wasn't satisfied with tithing. He basically said, if you haven't given, that you should not, the only way you can get away with saying that is if you've done it yourself. And he did. He gave away his inheritance. Yeah.
I think he must have come to the realization, in his hermithood, of what it meant to be hungry. You can't be a hermit in the desert or anywhere and not have encountered hunger at some point.
Yeah.
It's a very unique lifestyle.
I think that's why they do these hunger days with teenagers especially, so that they can know what it feels like. I had an experience when I was in college where I had no money and nobody to turn to, and I opened my cabinet and I had half a bag of rice and a can of tomato soup. And that really has stuck with me because that is a really depressing feeling. I think I had some rice and tomato soup that day, and money arrived in the mail the next day. But it's really depressing to be down that far. And I didn't even have to experience hunger. I just had a very limited meal that day. And that's a good seed to the next section, which is, he's talking, they're in a situation of famine. And he's talking about, imagine this is a situation where people who have money are raising their prices, say like a drug company, because the demand is there, the crops have failed. So anybody who has grain stored away has the option to raise prices on it because the amount available is less and the demand is still there. So one of the things that happens is that parents are faced with this situation where the whole family can starve, or that they can take one of their children and sell them as slaves. And that way that child at least will get a meal, and they can take the money they received for that child and feed the rest. So it seems like the only way they can stay alive. But what a horrific situation for any parent to be in. So the next section we're going to read talks about that, where it says the plight of the poor. Somebody want to read?
Okay. They turned their gaze to their own children, thinking that perhaps by bringing them to the slave market, they might find some respite from death. Consider now the violent struggle that takes place between the desperation arising from famine and a parent's fundamental instincts. Starvation on the one side threatens a horrible death, while nature resists, convincing the parents rather to die with their children. Time and again they vacillate, but in the end they succumb, driven by want and cruel necessity. And what does a parent think at such times? Which one should I sell first? Which one will earn the greatest favor with the grain merchant? Should I choose the eldest? But I cannot bear to do so, since he is the firstborn. The youngest? But I take pity on his youth, as yet untouched by tragedy. This one looks just like his mother. That one shows aptitude in his lessons. Curse this helplessness. What am I to do? Which of my children shall I strike? What kind of beast shall I become? How can I forget the bond of nature? If I hold on to all of them, I must watch them all perish with hunger. If I send one of them away, how will I be able to look the others in the eye ever again? They will always view me with suspicion and mistrust. How can I manage my household when I am responsible for the loss of one of my own children? How can I ever sit down at the table, which now has plenty of food as the result of such a decision? And while the parents come with tears streaming down their faces to sell the dearest of their children, you are not swayed by their sufferings. You take no account of nature. While famine oppresses these miserable wretches, you hem and haw, feigning ignorance of their plight, and thus prolonging the agony. They come offering their very heart in exchange for food. And yet not only is your hand not stricken with paralysis for taking profits from such misfortune, but you haggle for even more. You wrangle so as to take much and give little in return, increasing the tragedy on every side for these wretches. Tears do not move you, groans do not soften your heart, but you remain adamant and unbending.
Reaction?
This is some of what happened in the Depression era, based on what I've learned from people who've been through it. And you have your kids to orphanages because they didn't feed them.
Yeah.
So
But at least in an orphanage, when they finally reached adulthood, they wouldn't still be slaves.
Yeah, so
yes and no.
Yeah, I mean, it was a terrible life,
Yeah.
and a lot of them died in the orphanages.
I saw on Facebook this past week a video of children in Pakistan who've been sold to make rugs,
Mm-hmm.
and they are
Yeah,
sold, and that's it. And it was the very same. It was an advocacy video, so it pulled the heartstrings, but it was really almost taken straight from this. It was amazing, and it's happening today. I mean, get a fair trade rug. That's all I can say.
well, yeah, I mean, you see children sold into prostitution too, and that's not uncommon.
And it happens in our country too. I actually
Yes.
know a young lady who came out of that, but that's what her parents did. You know, from a wealthy family in Roswell.
Really?
What do you mean, they sold her?
Yeah.
Really?
And
They
they were wealthy.
prostituted their daughter.
And they were wealthy.
Yes. Because they just, it's that debased nature. Wherever they came from, whatever caused them to do that, and it's not that they had to.
I found myself thinking of all the ways that capitalism gives a message that says your obligation is to make as much money as you can. And that would mean that if you have grain that you could sell for more, you should sell it for more, because that's the virtue it's preaching. And he is going against that whole message and saying that you shouldn't take advantage of the poor. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. And I could point to example after example. Look at what's happened with drug prices, where people are dying because they can't afford the medications. And the drug companies keep pushing the prices up because they can. And they blind themselves, which is what he's saying here. They're blinding themselves to the human loss. And his message is that we are of one nature, and you can't separate yourself from others that way.
One of the things I think about, especially living in America, but it could be similar in Australia, but is the pressure around your retirement, and that also the same Social Security might be there, and so on. and sort of a fear-based pressure that's coming 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the track toward you, and so you could have some money in a retirement account, and then then the dilemma of needing someone who's about to be evicted, and so on. I find that really hard. Which way do you go? And anyway, so there's certain things in our society that place a lot of fear, I think, around us in terms of the practice of really expansive giving, generosity.
Yeah, it's almost just like his vision will work if everybody does it. If you really can trust on everybody else, as I was talking about with the Social Security workers, if you know that when you're in need, they will help you, then there's less pressure on each individual to have to prepare for the unforeseen. He does in other places, we're not looking at them today, he does talk about people saying, well, I will leave my money to the poor in my will. And why that's, the poor need your money now, not when you die, is essentially what he says. Let's look at the last piece, and then we will talk about the questions. So if somebody wants to read the section on greed. John, I'm sorry. I'm looking at somebody with who can speak loudly enough.
But if you acknowledge that they were given to you by God, then tell me, for what purpose did you receive them? Is God unjust when he distributes to us unequally the things that are necessary for life? Why then are you wealthy while another is poor? Why else but so that you might receive the reward of benevolence and faithful stewardship, while the poor are honored for patient endurance in their struggles. But you, stuffing everything into the bottomless pockets of your greed, assume that you wrong no one. Yet how many do you, in fact, dispossess? Who are the needy? Those who are not satisfied with what suffices for their own needs? Who are the robbers? Those who take for themselves what rightfully belongs to everyone. And you, are you not greedy? Are you not a robber? The things you received in trust as stewardship, have you not appropriated them for yourself? Is not the person who strips another of clothing called a thief? And those who do not clothe the naked when they have the power to do so, should they not be called the same? The bread you are holding back is for the hungry. The clothes that you keep put away for the naked. The shoes that are rotting away with the shoes are for those who have none. The silver you keep buried in the earth is for the needy. You are thus guilty of injustice toward as many as you might have aided, and did not. How can I bring the sufferings of the poor to your attention so that you might realize from what misery you are collecting riches for yourself?
That was the part highlighted in black was what got me thinking about Basil. I came across this quotation. And thinking how you might answer that. I have friends who are comfortably upper middle class, and when I go visit them, and I walk into the pantry, I'm ready to pass out. You've got enough there to feed a family of 4 for a year. And you open the refrigerator, the big refrigerator, food falling out of it. There's just 2 of them. And I made some comment about, my goodness, you've got a lot of food here. And you know half of it's going to end up being thrown out. And they're good people. They're good, generous people. But it never occurs to them that there is something wrong about somebody having this much food that's just sitting there until it rots, and other people who are looking at a bag of rice, and that's about all they have in the refrigerator. I think some of what he's talking about here is people not getting the big picture. So let's
And
go.
not particularly wanting to.
Well, yeah.
It's so discomforting.
It's just weird, I mean, everyone in here, no matter how, even with your bag of rice, you had far more food than a lot of people did.
Yeah, I did not starve.
Right, I mean, that bag of rice is something someone's dreaming of right now in
Yeah.
Bangladesh, right?
Exactly.
So it can be a spiral. It's easy for me to say, yeah, they have way too much food in their cupboard, but there's plenty of people who have too much food in mine, you know, so, and that's where I have a hard time getting a grasp on it.
That's why we're talking about, what time is it? Do we have time for this question? If we don't have time, quarter after, we've got 5 minutes. So the question to be asked is how much is enough and how much is too much? And these are good questions. And then what is my responsibility to others and why? I think most of us do want a reserve. We just don't have that kind of trust that, Jesus said, live for today essentially and don't worry about tomorrow. But that's hard to do.
Well, it's not just that. It's a lot more complicated. For one thing, we become immune to need. Every time you turn the TV on, there's something that breaks your heart. Mm-hmm. And also, it's complex. In order to form a library, you have to be able to acquire some money to start things. And there's also the whole idea that the trickle-down theory, which I don't totally buy, but there is something to be said for an economy needs to be doing well. There need to be people who put investments not directly to the poor, like you were saying with the family where, either, you invest in one thing so the whole family can do it or everybody dies. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's that. There's what my horrible sister used to say to my mother. When we were kids, Mother would say, well, finish up your plate. There are children in China or whatever that are starving to death. And my sister would say, well, send it to them then. And so there is the problem of distribution. Mm-hmm. Just in Toastmasters yesterday, we asked this wonderful Chinese doctor, immigrant. The question was, how do you teach your children, we knew she had young children, how do you teach them for outreach and everything? And I was shocked at her answer. She said, well, I started giving them a little bit of allowance, and I've showed them that you have to put it in a jar and save it in case you need it again. And I thought, wait a minute, how does this relate? And I'm sure she meant more than what I heard, but I was still surprised.
Yeah, well, certainly not going to let them learn how to
But
spend
it's
money.
complex. It's not as simple as, give away some. I mean, I don't think it's that easy to say. It's just, and there's the thing, take care of yourself first, so you have something to give. If
He
you
would say
died of
that's,
starvation in graduate school.
he would say the opposite message. He would say, simplify your life, live more simply, don't spend so much money. And he talks about, how happy is that gold going to make you? Are you going to be able to eat it? You can't eat gold. Your jewels, your fine clothing. Live a simpler life, and that way you'll have more money to give to people who need it.
And what about the doctrine of prosperity, the seed-load and everything that I saw some of that in here, that, if I give away everything, gold will come to me.
I think he's saying that God trusts that your needs will be met. Consider the lilies of the field.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I was just reminded of the interpretation of that. Jesus feeds 5,000. So there's a miracle that occurred there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Miracle. I've heard it said, and I'm not taking anything away from Jesus because he had the power to make that happen. But an interpretation was that people were receiving the basket and instead of taking things out, they were putting things in. And that was a miracle, right?
Yeah.
It was a miracle because they started off with just a few loaves and some fish, and they ended up with all those baskets at the end. So there's a miracle here that we could be talking about as well, right? Not only is it the human aspect, but there's the miracle, God, divine part of this too, where if we all contribute, it's a miracle, right? There's more than enough. And I think maybe that's part of that lesson.
Yeah. Well, I think he could see for himself in an area that was starving that they had enough food. It was a question of where it was. And that was an extreme situation, but I think we could apply it today. It was what was already there, what God had already been given, was being distributed. So, anyway, I wish we had enough of these questions to go around, but you can take them. I hope you will think about these questions. I don't think it's easy. You don't see me emptying out my bank account. But it's a challenge. And it's something to think about.
When I was working with the Vietnamese kids, I have a very wealthy friend. She said, I'll never let them spend on this, which of course she did. And they came